The next panel is going to be about the role of social and ethical implications in the role of generative AI. And as we've just heard, AI is going to play a larger and larger role in our lives. So how can we look at responsible AI to help us get there in a responsible way? Deepa Mishram is going to be the moderator for our next panel.
All right, so now I can stop answering, we'll start asking questions. Hopefully the last session was exciting. I really enjoyed it. Folks, if you can settle down so we can get started. I know we have yet another panel to squeeze after this one, and it's a Friday afternoon, so we'll probably get started really quickly. Really excited to be talking about the responsible AI. Now, we heard a little bit more about earlier, we talked about what is the role of AI in enterprise and how it's going to change the way we work. Now we talk about the people who are making AI more responsible and reliable. We have an amazing panel of people today. Let me ask the panel to quickly introduce themselves and their company in just one sentence each, and then we'll get in the discussion. We'll start with you.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Will Uppington. I'm the CEO and co-founder of TruEra. We help people to monitor, test, debug, and explain machine learning systems.
Hey everybody, Robert Mosley. I run the implementation and consulting team at Copy AI. We have 8 million customers, so I'm sure there's a lot of people in here that have an account. So great to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Krishnaram Gintapadi. I'm the Chief Scientist and Chief AI Officer at Fiddler. Fiddler AI is an enterprise startup building a responsible AI and model monitoring platform.
Great. So we have, folks, as you can see, we have 2 startups which help others make their AI more reliable, responsible, and predictable. And we also have a full stack application which is in production now and lots of experience on the table here. So we'll start out, I think, how many of you really think that the problem of trust and safety and reliability of generative AI is a real stumbling block, and by raise of hands? So it's probably one of the first problems that people are worried about in terms of, so we have the people who are actually solving this problem in practice today. So let me ask each of the panelists to talk a little bit about, maybe starting with Krishnaram, you first. What does quality and trust mean to you in terms of generative AI, and how do you folks think about it in terms of solving it?
Great question. When it comes to generative AI, we should think of not just the correctness or the accuracy of the response. I think that is a big concern. We heard a lot about the models hallucinating or making up responses. In addition to accuracy or quality, we also need to think about, are these models producing any biases? Are there biases like gender biases or racial biases or other types of biases? There are recent studies showing that these models exhibit different types of biases. Some of these biases may not even be obvious at an per output level, but when you look at the model's output over several aggregated responses, these kinds of biases start showing up. So another concern is around explaining the output of the models. Even the model developers often have a tough time understanding how the generative AI models are behaving. Then of course we briefly discussed about misinformation, attributing the response to where the data came from and so on. There are lots of these issues, and at Fiddler we are looking at these issues holistically. We're starting with understanding how the model is behaving over time and being able to track and monitor the behavior of the model over time, and that's the first step.
So Krishna, just to follow up that, for those of you, the people in the audience who may not have experienced this themselves, can you actually monitor a model in AI model in production? Do you have tools today, if you look at generative AI, to be able to say that is the model performing as desired by the business? Do we have that in place?
Yes. One of the challenges is that with traditional machine learning models, like say classification models, we can potentially track the accuracy of the model over time, and that too if we have access to some kind of feedback or ground truth labels in real time or near real time. With generative AI models, it becomes all the more challenging, because how do we say a poem generated by a model is good or bad? There may not even be notion of whether the notion of correctness or accuracy. So instead what we look at is is the distribution of the inputs to the model changing over time? Is the distribution of the output generated by the model changing over time? By representing these inputs and outputs in a high-dimensional space, as in the form of what are known as the embeddings, we are able to track whether this distribution is changing and use that to suggest whether the model is perhaps behaving in a way it's not supposed to behave.
Thank you. So, from Robert, from a Copy AI's perspective, what do you folks see as trust in the output and overall in generative AI?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the most important thing, because what we're focusing on is enabling this for the enterprise, right? So it has to be factual, it has to be accurate, otherwise they won't use it. And I'll just give like one example. We had a customer who was using us to generate emails. And so they were pumping in like LinkedIn data, and it was generating email. One of the emails that came out, it started off the email by saying like, "Hi Fiona, did you know your name means fair-skinned? That must explain why you're so pale." So I mean, obviously like that is just completely unacceptable in an enterprise use case. So like for any company or person to really want to adopt this at scale, like that has to be the case. Like you have to be able to verify that not only is it factually accurate, because you also can't have it then going on and making up like features and benefits of your product that don't exist. Not only are you going to offend the person, but you're also going to misinform them, and they might buy something that doesn't even exist. And so there was a really interesting part from the last panel about agents, and what we figured out is that sort of architecture is like really perfect here. You can have an action then the agent can take, which is actually a fact-checking and bias-check action. And in our testing against human evaluators, it actually performs better than human evaluators do, which allows you to kind of open up the floodgates and do that at scale.
Thank you. Will?
Yeah, so in terms of quality, I think it's really interesting to see the differences between the different types of models, right? Between discriminative models versus generative models. So with discriminative models, where, as we've talked about already, you can measure, they're trying to predict some kind of label, right, of data. You can often measure the accuracy. So for quality in that perspective, we think of it as, you know, that accuracy of performance. We think of operational factors like explainability, right, that you may need to do in order to take the next step into action. We think about societal factors like responsible AI, and we think about risk, right? As we talked about in the last panel, you can have overall, you know, a highly accurate model, but if there's those few times, very important times, that it could be wrong, right? That risk of being wrong can be a factor. When you come to generative models, though, it's different, right? Because you're not predicting a label, so that measure of accuracy is not something that you can easily calculate. So at Truero, the way we think about quality there is the 3 H's. So the first, is it helpful? The second, is it honest? And the third, is it harmless? Right? So those are the 3 main components we think about. That's captures some of the challenges with the hallucinations that we point out with honesty and kind of discrimination as well. But it's very interesting to think about the helpful piece, because that presents a real challenge for everybody, right? How do you define what is actually helpful? And that's where I think that's one of the big challenges, you know, right now, is how do you go about doing that, especially since that's quite different with the large variety of applications that occur, that are being created in the generative AI world.
Great. So having understood what you each think is the challenge, let me turn to how you think people can start to address that. So let's take an example. If you have any examples that you can relate to of a real customer use case, that's be great. But otherwise, if somebody's trying to build a generative AI model for a certain business use case, what's your advice, and how do they think about the trust and the responsible part of it? Is that an afterthought? Is that part of the process of building the model? What's your way of working or asking these developers to think about it?
Yeah, so I think that was a great leading question, because obviously you need to think about this from the very beginning, right? So if you're thinking about helpful, honest, and harmless, I think you have to really design for that from the very beginning. But that's a challenge, right? Because as I mentioned before, every time in terms of helpful, that's very custom. And then the other big challenge is, how do you actually scale that, right? So it's one thing doing it on a small scale, but if you're going to once you move this into production and you scale it. The other dimension of this challenge is development versus production. So how do you test for it during development, and then how do you monitor it, during your production? And I think we think that some of the ways to solve, so the advice I'd provide is that you have to come up with your own custom way of doing that. So just to give some examples, right? If you are working with some people who are building like e-commerce applications using generative AI, so like a shopping assistant, right? So the generative AI, ChatGPT, those kinds of models tend to be very good at general knowledge. So if you want to say, what are the things I should think about when I'm buying like a gutter or something, I've unfortunately had to buy some water pumps recently. Maybe other people have had to do that. So what are the things you think about when you're buying a water pump? They can be pretty good at coming out with, here's some things to think about: flow rate, what's the amount of water you need, that they can stop pumping to prime the pump, those kinds of things. Yeah, unfortunately, I do know a little bit too much about this. But then you, at some point in your journey, you come into a specific knowledge situation, which is like, okay, now I care about these kinds of characteristics of a product. What product should I get? And that's where the honesty or hallucination kind of thinking comes in, because you tend to find that these models do not do a very good job. So that's where you can switch over to using data sources that have the accurate information, in particular the index that you already have of the product catalog, right? So then you've got to figure out how you can leverage that index information in order to provide that kind of honesty. And then then the question becomes, how do you measure that, right? How do you measure this combined application between a general model and then your specific data that you're using? How do you measure that helpfulness, right? In this kind of case, it may be things like you want to measure click-through rate, other behavioral characteristics that you can capture on the site. You want to measure potentially explicit feedback, right? But you also want to do things like make sure that the prompt is not going to start talking about things that are not relevant to your subject. And I think you can come up, if you go through every other application, you'll find that these are very different things. Like Copy AI, I think you would be thinking about very different things to evaluate the quality. So thinking about this from the beginning, and I think that actually the performance of your application is going to vary to a large extent about how good you are at thinking about how to measure that quality, evaluate it, and then iteratively improve it over time.
Great, thanks. So Robert, maybe you can give some real color to a real product or a feature that you might have launched where something like this you were thinking of building, and walk us through what are the considerations that go into thinking about trust and reliability before you launch a particular feature or a product.
Yeah, definitely. So I know initially you asked too about like, should this sort of trust mechanism be built into the model? Like I don't think that should be done. Just because it'd be kind of like putting a governor on a car, like a race car, and like limiting it to 55 miles an hour instead of letting it go like 300. But what you can do is like put these safety rails on top of it, right? To like make it go 300, but make sure it's not gonna like crash into the crowd. So basically what we've done, like these large language models are really good at a few things. They're really good at writing, of course, and everybody's experienced that with ChatGPT. You've also probably experienced the hallucinations. Like they're not fact-based. They're tangential to reality, which is actually part of the power of them, right? Like they can make up stories. They could write like a bedtime story for your daughter, which I've had to do for me. But they can also summarize really well, right? So if I'm asking, say, Copy AI to do something, we've broken this up into steps, right? So it can perform these tasks, so it can research, and then we have it so it cites its sources. And those can be verified. You can have this other action that verifies, like, is what the model summarized here factual to the source? And then you go on to the writing step. So if I just go to like ChatGPT and I ask it to write me an email for my product, it will, and it'll actually look really good, and it'll make sense, but it may be completely non-factual. But if you have it first do these like research steps, cite their sources, and then pump that information into the writing step, then you get something that's factual and verifiable, and all the citations are right there.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point. So those of you who probably not seen that, I think there's lots of very interesting tools come out, even some search engines which are following similar methodology of sort of giving you a citation back to the source of information as one way of verifying what the information is. That's great. Krishna, Fiddler has done some really interesting things which I'd love to see if you can talk about, especially in the world of large language models. When these models tend to be somewhat stochastic, and in that when you ask the same question using slightly different words, you might get slightly different answers. So, for example, if you build a large model and ask the same question just by changing the order of the sequence, the answer technically could be somewhat different. And equally, when the models themselves change, the answers could start evolving as well. So if you're building an application where you have all this kind of variance in how the question is asked and what's the underlying model, what are the tools and the weapons we have today in the hands of developers to give some sense of control over the world and still give consistent responses and outcomes?
I think this is often referred to as robustness in machine learning. I think even in the previous panel, we had this discussion about consistency, repeatability of information as opposed to necessarily, even if the model may not necessarily be accurate, is it consistent in its information? I think something analogous is relevant even in any enterprise application. If say the prompt to a large language model has changed slightly, but the semantic meaning of the prompt has not changed, we as humans expect the model to respond in a similar manner. Imagine querying a chatbot for a customer service with two similar sounding queries and getting very different responses. So that's not something we would expect, or that would not be considered acceptable. One of the ways we have addressed this is to provide a quantitative way of measuring the robustness of a generative AI model. The intuition is if two inputs to the model are very similar or semantically the same, or the outputs generated by the model semantically the same or very similar, and we have figured out a way to quantify this. So more broadly, taking a step back, I would say that when building generative AI models, the first step is to understand, is there enough proprietary and rich data that the enterprise is better off building a model on this proprietary data as opposed to relying on publicly available, perhaps closed APIs. And if that is the case, then having all these aspects, thinking about all these aspects like robustness or accuracy or bias upfront would be very helpful, so that while developing the language model, developing the LLM or other generative AI models, you're having ways to quantify this and ways to measure this, not just during the model development, but also once the model is deployed. So I think that's really key.
Thank you. So those in the audience, I would certainly point out that the semantic meaning, the semantic understanding of language is something I think all of us will get more and more familiar with these use of large language models. It's really what the words mean rather than just how they're written, and how can we find patterns in that. And I think what Krishnam is pointing out is, if you're worried about this, there are tools available today which can help you keep track of the model's performance in that context. Will, I'll probably ask you a quick question. You folks talk a lot about model quality, and you talk about AI quality. How do you define quality in the model world of generative AI? Is that any different from AI before, or how does one measure quality? And is there a metric that you suggest? You mentioned a way of doing it earlier. Maybe you can define how can people still think about the model quality?
Yeah. So I think the discriminative, as I was mentioning before, discriminative versus generative, the definition of quality varies. So on the generative side, again, back to we think about these 3 H's: helpful, harmless, honest. So the question is, how do you measure that and evaluate that? And I think some of the things that we just talked about in terms of robustness matter. Obviously, tracking your inputs and outputs and doing embedding tracking, that's something we also do with our customers. I think those are fairly narrow in the sense of really trying to get at solving those kind of, they're necessary, but there's more to be done to really solve this kind of helpful, harmless, and honest problem. And I think one of the things that we've been working on is this notion that we call feedback functions, which is actually you can use other models to assess and evaluate the output of a generative AI model as well. So if you think about it, the general concept is how do you take generated output, such as text, from a generative AI model, and then you run it through some kind of function, you get some kind of score or metric that you can use to evaluate quality. You can think of lots of different ways to do this, right? You can actually think of certain generative AI models being able to be part of these functions, right? So if you're worried about in a medical application that you don't want medical advice to be given, right? One of your functions could be, is this medical advice, right? That you can get that from a model. And increasingly, I think you can have these specialized models that are used for some of these evaluative kind of steps. So we think that actually the power of AI actually can be used to evaluate these more generative AI models with this kind of notion of feedback functions. And you can think about that as solving a lot of those kinds of problems around if it's honest, if it's harmless, and if it's helpful. And I think that that's one part of it. The other part of it is tracking those custom metrics that matter for your particular application. When that's going to be varied, by the particular application. Potentially using other models to, depending on what model you use, could introduce some expense as well. So you need to think through that. Think about kind of some lower cost ways of measuring, potentially, and more fancier ways that could be higher cost ways of measuring your quality as well.
Great. So let me sort of change track slightly. Let's put all of this aside. What we've heard is you all are seeing and building tools which can help people get quantifiable and trackable metrics for quality, for performance, and monitoring the model over changes. Let's say today, where are we in the big picture of how worried should we be in terms of going ahead and deploying these generative AI solutions in the world? What's your view? Are we at the point where we can go ahead in full force and start to build models in production and we can contain the beast while we're doing it? What's your view and what's your advice? If you had to have the audience take one thing from your experience so far, where do you think we are headed in the next maybe 3 to 4 months? Just your view. Maybe start with Krishna.
So my take is that we can't wait for the perfect solution before starting to deploy it. Just like what we learned in, say, web search or many other domains, once these systems are deployed, based on the feedback, we will figure out ways to further improve them. But the key thing is to have tools to monitor and measure these models before deployment as well as once they're deployed, so that at the least we know in which direction we are trending. Or when we have an existing model and a new model that we're able to deploy, or is the new model improving over existing model along all the dimensions we care about? Or even if we take an existing model and that remains in deployment, is that model degrading over time? Or is it improving based on the feedback and learning from the feedback? I think that is very important. So I would lean towards gradually deploying and getting feedback rather than just waiting for an ideal solution which may never arrive.
Robert, you already are in the market, so what's your view on this?
Yeah, I say let's go. I mean, this stuff is like, we're so early on, and there's so many, like literally in the last 6 months, like the stuff that I've seen and that I've worked on has like changed my perspective on the world. Like what's coming is just crazy. Like the applications are vast, and we would be remiss. Like a lot of people take kind of like a negative view, like you have to worry about the dangers, which is of course true. You definitely have to. Right? Can it do harmful things? Yes, it could, but we kind of know how to put guardrails on it. We already do that to a certain extent, like protecting against hackers, right? Like the AI can't access the systems if you give it like a user account, just like you would an employee, and it's acting like an employee, and it has to log in and verify what it is, and you can control the access that it has to various systems. But like the potential for this stuff, like just think like economically, so a lot of the customers are coming to us not to like replace work that humans are doing, but to do work that there aren't enough people to do. Like one example is like a huge retailer that we're working with. They have 600,000 products. They only have 20,000 product descriptions for those products because that's just what they had the resources to build. So, 580,000 products don't even have a description. And then they want those in 20 languages. And then they want them all to be SEO friendly and have meta descriptions, and they need ad copy in all those languages. And they want emails, like that's just, humans can't do that today, right? So, this stuff is opening up a whole new world of possibilities, and we could, I say, step on the gas pedal.
Thank you. Very interesting example.
Yeah, I think if you're thinking about where to start with these applications, I would say think about the stakes involved with the applications. Like lower stakes applications are a better place to start, I think, because you can experiment more and iterate. One of the challenges is you cannot like fully test these systems right. So there's gonna potentially be mistakes happening, those kinds of things. So in a lower stakes application, you've got more room for error versus a higher stakes application. And there's also going to be, I think there's going to be kind of a bit of like a hype cycle here of people trying a bunch of things and then seeing reactions, right? Your actual example is a great one of thinking about that, right? So if you think about generating copy for use in SEO, well, all the SEO engines say that if you use automatic means to create your copy, we're gonna ding that content, we're gonna ban that content. Right, so is that going to change? Because this retailer that goes and does this for SEO and it creates all these automatically generated content, they have a chance of getting a penalty in Google. Maybe that's not the right thing anymore.
So Google in February actually announced that they're not going to penalize AI-generated content. They're going to penalize low-quality content. So like their official perspective now is AI content is fine as long as it doesn't suck, basically.
Yeah, so these are the things that have to change, right? In terms of now the question comes, what's low quality content, and if there's going to be a bias for automatically generated content or not, we'll see. But I think that's an example of these kind of the stakes of the applications that to consider when you're trying to figure out which one to do.
Great, thank you. I think we're almost out of time. The thing that I would love the audience to take away from this is there are tools and methods. Sometimes AI itself can be used to help manage these models, the way they perform and how they can be monitored. And it's, at least the panel believes, and they're seeing examples that we should not necessarily have to wait for deploying it. But yes, of course, we have to be careful in how this is deployed. Thank you very much. I would like the panel to rise and get your applause as well. Do we have time for questions at all? Okay, so maybe just take one or two questions. Is anybody who has a burning question we can take? Maybe.
I'm wondering whether one of you can discuss a little bit about legally permissible data sets, and I haven't really heard much about use of data sets where there's intellectual property involved or other ownership rights, and what do you think sort of the pain points there might be?
I can take that. I think if I understood right, the question was around the data sets used for training these models and whether
they're legally permissible and challenged, which some of them are now, right, as we know.
I think there is a sense that many of these models are often regenerating data from the training corpus, especially when it comes to text-to-image models. And there is also debate about what are the copyright implications. Should this model be viewed as a machine learning model, or should it be viewed as a database? If there is a perception that this is a database, then the copyright implications would be extremely different. I think this is one reason why I believe that enterprises will move towards training large language models or other generative AI models on their proprietary corpus, or at least on corpus that they have more control over, so they know what is the data over which they're training. So rather than just relying on off-the-shelf models or relying on closed API models, I think we will see a trend towards perhaps lower-sized models, but trained on all the 80% data that we discussed earlier, the proprietary data that is sitting inside enterprises. And when that happens, I think all these dimensions, the correctness, bias, and other dimensions will become also at least as important and will continue to remain important.
Thank you, Krishna. That's actually a very good and a very important question. Again, thanks for asking. I think we are very much out of time. Thank you for everyone in the panel for joining us for a fascinating discussion. Thanks again.